Imagine a country where women are statistically outperforming men in development so significantly that their gender development index is ranked like #1 in the entire world.
Number one. Yeah.
Right? A score so perfectly balanced, it actually tips just slightly in favor of women across all these key human development metrics.
Which is incredibly rare.
It is. But now, I want you to imagine that exact same country,
Yeah.
the one supposedly leading the globe in gender development,
Mhm.
ranking a dismal 121st when measured for actual gender inequality.
It's just a massive
It
contradiction.
really is. Today, we are looking at Namibia,
Mhm.
and we're looking at what happens when equality on a spreadsheet just completely fractures when it meets the reality of lived experience.
Yeah, it is the ultimate diagnostic paradox. You're looking at a society that, well, on paper has achieved this statistical milestone that most developed high-income nations haven't even managed to reach.
Right, a gender development index, the GDI, a 1.011.
Exactly. And anything over 1.0 means the female metrics have actually surpassed the male metrics. But the moment you shift your lens from the GDI to the gender inequality index, the GII, the whole illusion just shatters.
You go from rank #1 to rank 121.
Yeah. It forces us to ask this really uncomfortable question. What exactly are we measuring when we declare a society equal?
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're unpacking a comprehensive, really dense 15-page analytical report on Namibia's human development and gender equality.
There is a mountain of data here.
Oh, yeah. Spanning all the way from 1990 to 2023. And this isn't just about reading off numbers to you. We're treating this data like, I don't know, a detective story.
I like that analogy.
Because if you only look at the top-line headlines, you walk away with a fundamentally distorted view of how a society functions.
Oh.
So we are going to deconstruct this equality paradox layer by layer.
And if that contradiction ranking first in development but 121st in inequality, if that makes you pause, it absolutely should. It highlights a massive vulnerability in how the global community consumes data.
We just love a simple ranking.
We really do. We rely so heavily on these composite indices. We want a single digestible number that tells us who's winning and who's losing. But, an average is a brilliant place to hide structural rot.
Wow, yeah.
If we don't look at the raw components driving those numbers, we end up celebrating a mathematical quirk rather than actual human progress.
Okay, so I know our audience is pretty well versed in the alphabet soup of global development. HDI, GDI, GII, IHDI, PHDI.
It's a lot of acronyms.
It's a ton.
Hmm.
We know these are the tools used to measure the health, wealth, and education of the population. So let's just bypass the textbook definitions and jump straight into the anomaly. Let's start by looking at Namibia's overarching trajectory on the Standard Human Development Index, the HDI.
Right, the historical baseline here is really crucial. In 1990, roughly around the time Namibia gained independence, their HDI sat at 0.597.
Okay.
And over the next 3 decades, we see this really steady, persistent climb. By 2023, they reached 0.665.
And just for context for everyone listening, the global average HDI right now is roughly 0.756. So Namibia is making undeniable progress. They're firmly categorized as a medium human development country, sitting at 143rd globally on that specific index.
Yeah, it's solid progress.
But it hasn't been a completely smooth ride, right? The data highlights a very sharp and notable dip in 2021, where the HDI fell back down to 0.631 before stabilizing again.
Yeah, that 2021 contraction is, well, it's a textbook example of how external environmental and global shocks just disproportionately impact developing nations.
Right, because of the pandemic and supply chains.
Exactly. During that period, the entire globe was navigating these unprecedented supply chain disruptions and rolling health crises. But while high-income nations have these deep economic buffers, they can print money, they can subsidize entire industries to keep them afloat, a medium development economy experiences those shocks as a direct hit to living standards and health outcomes.
They just don't have the shock absorbers.
Precisely. However, the fact that they rebounded back to 0.665 by 2023, that indicates a really profound level of institutional and societal resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because here is where we have to start questioning the lens itself.
Yeah.
The HDI tells us that, on average, things are getting better. But average is a really slippery concept.
Oh, it's the fatal flaw of aggregation. The HDI measures the average longevity, the average knowledge, the average standard of living. It tells you absolutely nothing about the distribution of those assets.
Right.
It doesn't tell you if the wealth is held by 10% of the population while the rest struggle. It doesn't tell you if one demographic is living to 80 while another rarely sees 50.
I always think about it like a student's overall GPA. Like, a 3.5 GPA sounds great, but might completely hide the fact that the student is actually failing math, but just acing art and history.
That's exactly it.
To really understand the student, you have to look at the subscores. Think about how your own country or community measures success. Do those top-line numbers reflect your daily reality? Averages just smooth out all the rough edges of real life.
And that smoothing effect is exactly why the United Nations had to develop all those other indices. The standard HDI just wasn't capturing the friction of real life.
We needed more tools.
Yeah, tools to penalize that score based on internal inequality, environmental degradation, and most importantly for our discussion today, the gender divide.
So let's break apart that steadily climbing HDI and look at its first major pillar, which is health and longevity. Because if we want to understand how Namibia engineered a #1 ranking in gender development, we have to look at the sheer volatility of their life expectancy.
It really is wild.
The data here is genuinely staggering.
It is one of the most dramatic demographic fluctuations you will find in modern data. Let's look at the timeline. In 1990, life expectancy for women was roughly 64 years, and for men, it was around 58.
Which is, a fairly standard baseline for a developing nation entering a new era.
Right.
But then we cross into the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the numbers don't just dip, they fall off an absolute cliff. The data shows that by 2001, the average life expectancy for the entire population plummeted to an anomalous, terrifying low of just 51.9 years.
It's hard to even process that number.
Women dropped to under 54 years, and men fell to just over 50.
We really have to stop and just unpack the sociological weight of that. A national life expectancy dropping into the low 50s is the mathematical footprint of a demographic catastrophe. We're looking at a data set, sure, but those numbers represent a massive generational public health crisis. While the raw data simply plots the points on a graph, anyone familiar with the regional history of Southern Africa in the early 2000s knows this era was defined by severe systemic health epidemics that relentlessly hollowed out entire communities.
I mean, think about what a society feels like when the average life ends at 51. You aren't just losing people, you are losing the core of your society.
Exactly. You lose your experienced middle management, you lose your veteran teachers, you lose the institutional memory of your civil service.
And families are just torn apart.
Completely. On a familial level, it creates a massive structural gap. You end up with a demographic sinkhole where the working age population is decimated, leaving a society composed disproportionately of the very young and the very old.
So you have grandparents raising orphans.
Yes. The entire labor force and economic trajectory of a nation is fundamentally altered when the expectation of life is cut down by a decade and a half.
It's just an invisible tax on every single mechanism of progress. Rebuilding from a shock like that isn't just a matter of importing medicine. It requires a wholesale reconstruction of societal scaffolding.
And that takes decades.
But the incredible thing about this data set is that it proves they did rebuild. By 2023, life expectancy had rebounded massively to 67.39 years overall.
It's a phenomenal recovery, honestly. It points to immense structural effort, the scaling up of public health interventions, and just an incredible resilience within the population itself.
A 15-year swing in a single generation.
Yeah, to claw back 15 years of life expectancy across a national average in 2 decades is a monumental achievement in human development.
But even with that incredible rebound, 67.39 years is still notably below the global average of 73.3 years. However, here's the detail that is going to become the linchpin of our entire paradox. Let's look at the gender split in that 2023 recovery.
The gender gap in health outcomes is stark. While the average is 67.39, women have rebounded to an average life expectancy of 71.3 years. Men, on the other hand, are sitting at 63.3 years.
That is a definitive 8-year advantage for women in the health dimension. Women are surviving significantly longer than men. Keep that 8-year gap in mind, everyone, because it is the first major ingredient in the mathematical recipe that creates that #1 GDI ranking.
But health is only one side of the development coin. To truly understand the engine driving this gender equality paradox, we have to move from the clinic to the classroom.
Right.
This brings us to the second dimension of human development, education. And this is where the data reveals a profound structural flip in social dynamics.
Exactly, because historically, and in many parts of the developing world today, the education data skews heavily male. But the report gives us two distinct metrics to measure knowledge acquisition. We have expected years of schooling, which is basically the forecast for a child entering the system today.
Right.
And we have mean years of schooling, which is the actual average years of formal education attained by adults aged 25 and older.
Let's analyze the youth pipeline first. The expected years of schooling in 2023 shows a landscape of almost perfect statistical parity. Women are at 11.76 years, and men are at 11.79 years.
It's basically a tie.
For all practical purposes, yes, that is a dead heat at the starting line of the educational journey. Boys and girls are entering the system with the same institutional forecast for their educational lifespan.
But when we look at the adults, the people actually operating the economy right now, using the mean years of schooling metric, we see the education dividend clearly favoring women. Adult women possess an average of 7.54 years of formal schooling compared to adult men who average exactly 7.0 years.
Now, a half-year difference might sound negligible in isolation, like it's just a few months. But when you aggregate that across an entire national population of adults, it is a highly significant statistical divergence.
It shifts the whole demographic profile.
Exactly. It means women are consistently staying in the educational system longer. They are attaining higher levels of formal credentialing. This is the second major ingredient driving that high GDI. Women hold a definitive advantage in knowledge acquisition.
So let's follow the standard economic logic here. If you connect this to the bigger picture, and you have a demographic that is living 8 years longer, and they are measurably more educated, the human capital model tells us that this should translate into greater economic power.
That's the theory, anyway.
Right. The promise of modern development is that education is the great equalizer. You put the time in, you get the credentials, and the labor market rewards you with higher wages and better opportunities.
That is the foundational promise of the education dividend. Higher human capital accumulation should organically lead to higher productivity,
Right.
which in turn commands higher wages.
Right.
But the data from Namibia completely shatters that assumption. The human capital model fails catastrophically when it meets the reality of the Namibian labor market. This is where we hit the income chasm.
And chasm is the only word for it. Let's look at the gross national income per capita, measured in 2021 purchasing power parity dollars to account for the actual cost of living. The GNI for Namibian women is roughly $9,350. For men, it is over $12,550.
Let's just let the weight of that contradiction sink in for a second. The demographic that is definitively more educated is earning roughly 34% less.
That's wild.
The education dividend has completely failed to translate into equitable economic empowerment. The formal credential is just not opening the economic door.
So what does this all mean? If you play by the rules, stay in school longer, and get more education, why is the paycheck still so much smaller?
It's incredibly frustrating.
It's like buying a VIP ticket to a concert.
Yeah.
You do everything right. You save up, you buy the premium pass, you show up early, and then security looks at your ticket, nods, and tells you to go stand out in the parking lot while a guy with a general admission ticket is escorted to the front row.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the structural failure happening here.
The credential is real, but the venue is operating under a completely different set of rules that renders your ticket basically useless.
The VIP credential, the education, is mathematically verified by the data. But the venue, the labor market, has these structural, unseen barriers that prevent women from actually cashing in that ticket.
Now, to be fair to Namibia, this income gap is a global pathology. It's everywhere. The report provides the global context. Worldwide, men earn roughly $25,750 compared to women's $14,940.
Right. So globally, men are earning roughly 1.7 times more than women.
Yeah, so Namibia's gap is actually smaller than the global average. But the contradiction feels so much sharper in Namibia precisely because the women have such a clear educational advantage. If you are more educated, why is the paycheck still a third lighter?
This requires us to look beyond the basic numbers and interrogate the mechanics of occupational segregation. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because labor markets are rarely neutral.
No, they are not.
Even with higher educational attainment, women are frequently concentrated or corralled into specific sectors of the economy: care work, service industries, administrative roles, or the massive informal economy.
Right.
And these sectors are structurally undervalued and underpaid compared to male-dominated sectors like mining, large-scale agriculture, or heavy infrastructure.
I really want to dig into that concept of the informal economy, Because when we say occupational segregation, it sounds very clinical. But what does that actually look like on the ground?
It's gritty.
We are talking about women who might have secondary education, but are forced into unregulated domestic work, street vending, or subsistence agriculture, because the formal corporate or industrial jobs are gatekept, either culturally or systematically.
Exactly. And we also have to factor in the devastating economic anchor of unpaid domestic labor. Across the globe, but particularly in developing economies, the burden of household management, child rearing, and elder care falls disproportionately, often exclusively on women.
Which takes up so much of the day.
It creates a severe phenomenon known as time poverty.
Time poverty. Wow, that is a brilliant term.
If you are spending 5 or 6 hours a day on uncompensated, mandatory domestic labor just to keep your family functioning, you mathematically cannot compete in the formal labor market at the same intensity as a male peer who has those 6 hours freed up for paid work or career advancement.
It's impossible.
The education doesn't matter if you simply don't have the hours in the day to deploy it. The structural rules of the society dilute the value of the education.
So we have women living significantly longer, learning significantly more, and earning significantly less. This massive, glaring disconnect between education and income is exactly what breaks the math on the Gender Development Index.
It totally breaks it.
It is time to peel back the curtain. How does a country with a 34% gender income gap get crowned the most gender-equal country in the world on this specific index?
It comes down to the literal, ruthless arithmetic of how the index is constructed. The GDI is not a holistic measure of human rights. It is simply a ratio.
Right, it's just math.
To calculate it, statisticians determine the Human Development Index score for the female population, then they determine the HDI score for the male population, and they divide the female score by the male score.
Female HDI divided by male HDI. It's literally just a fraction.
Yes. Now recall the 3 dimensions that make up those scores: health, education, and income. In Namibia, as we've established, women have a massive 8-year lead in the health dimension.
Yep.
They also have a solid half-year lead in the adult education dimension. So in 2 out of the 3 variables that make up the formula, the female numbers are significantly higher than the male numbers.
Oh man, I see the mathematical trap here.
Exactly. When you plug these raw numbers into the algorithm, the extraordinarily high female scores in longevity and schooling mathematically cancel out or offset the severe 34% disadvantage women face in the income dimension.
It just washes it away.
The algorithm doesn't care about context. It just averages the inputs. Because the health and education leads are so strong, the final composite female HDI score actually eclipses the male HDI score. When you divide the larger female number by the smaller male number, you get a ratio of 1.011.
And since 1.0 is perfect equality.
Since 1.0 represents perfect statistical parity, a score of 1.011 projects the illusion that women are actually outperforming men in overall development.
This is the spreadsheet illusion we warned you about at the very beginning of the deep dive. It creates a headline that makes it look like women have crossed the finish line of equality and are actually taking a victory lap.
Which is just not true.
But if you walk into a business district in Windhoek and tell a woman earning $9,300 while her less educated male peer at the next desk earns $12,500 that she has achieved perfect parity, she is going to laugh you out of the room.
Absolutely.
Have you ever read a headline praising a company or a country for a #1 ranking only to realize the criteria were totally skewed? This is exactly why you have to look at the raw data.
It exposes a deep philosophical flaw in how global institutions design and how the public consumes data. We desperately want a scoreboard. We want an easy, digestible metric so we can say, country X is winning.
We love a top 10 list.
But celebrating a composite number like the GDI without interrogating its subcomponents is deeply misleading. A score of 1.011 is not a measure of absolute gender equality in social status, political power, bodily autonomy, or economic freedom.
No.
It is merely a numerical balance within 3 highly aggregated dimensions.
The math is literally trading years of life for a lower salary.
Precisely. The index essentially treats a longer lifespan as a perfectly acceptable equal trade-off for systemic wage suppression.
That's horrifying when you put it like that.
But human lives don't function like algebraic equations. You cannot pay your rent or feed your children or start a business using your extra years of life expectancy. A long life lived in economic subordination is not equality.
You cannot pay your rent with life expectancy. That's the crux of the entire paradox. The GDI is mathematically accurate, but practically absurd.
Well said.
So if the GBI is the spreadsheet illusion, the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, is the harsh, sobering wake-up call. Let's pivot and look at why Namibia, the supposed champion of gender development, ranks 121st globally on the inequality metric.
Right, so the GII was designed specifically to catch the nuances that the GDI misses. Instead of looking at basic achievements, the GII measures the loss in potential human development due to disparity between female and male achievements.
Okay.
It shifts the focus from broad averages to specific vulnerabilities. It evaluates three entirely different dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. And unlike the GDI, where a higher score is better, the GII functions like a golf score. A lower number means less inequality.
Got it.
Namibia's score is 0.440, dropping them all the way to 121st in the world.
Let's start with the first dimension of the GII, because honestly, it contains the most alarming, visceral data points in this entire 15-page report: reproductive health. This dimension measures two specific things: the maternal mortality ratio and the adolescent birth rate. And the numbers here just rip the mask off the illusion of parity.
They reveal an incredible depth of hidden vulnerability. The maternal mortality ratio in Namibia sits at 214.6 deaths per 100,000 live births.
214.6.
That is a staggering, heartbreaking figure. It means that the fundamental biological act of giving birth carries a deeply disproportionate systemic risk to a woman's life.
You can't call that equal.
You cannot claim gender equality when the basic mechanics of reproduction are inherently lethal for a significant portion of the population.
And then we look at the second metric in this dimension, which is the adolescent birth rate. This tracks the number of births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19. In Namibia, that rate is 66.0.
To contextualize that, the global average adolescent birth rate is roughly 39.0. Namibia's rate is massively higher than the global norm.
I want to tie this back to the education data we praised earlier. Because if we synthesize these data points, we can literally see the gears of inequality grinding down potential. We talk about how women have an expected 11.76 years of schooling, but a teen pregnancy rate of 66 per 1,000 acts as a massive societal disruptor.
Exactly. It completely short-circuits the human capital pipeline. When an adolescent girl becomes pregnant, she is almost universally pulled out of that educational system.
The schooling just stops.
She is abruptly shoved into the immense responsibilities of motherhood, almost always without a robust economic safety net. Her trajectory shifts from knowledge acquisition to immediate survival.
This connects perfectly to why the income chasm is so vast. The women who do manage to stay in school and graduate face the occupational segregation and wage suppression we discussed. But a massive disproportionate segment of young women are having their potential structurally curtailed before they even reach the adult labor market.
It's a double bind.
The GDI measures the women who made it through the system. The GII measures the women who were failed by it.
That is a vital distinction. But the GII doesn't just measure vulnerabilities, it also attempts to measure empowerment. And this is where the data throws us another fascinating curveball.
Okay, lay it on me.
The empowerment dimension tracks the share of seats in parliament held by women. And here, Namibia shows extraordinary progress.
It's a major bright spot in the report. In 1990, women held only 17.3% of parliamentary seats. By 2023, that number has more than doubled to 35.6%. Over a third of the legislative body is female.
Which is excellent, especially when you compare it to the global average, which is lagging at just 26.5%. By all accounts, women in Namibia are highly visible in the highest echelons of political power.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Wait, stop right there. I want to push back on this because this feels like a massive contradiction. We just established that the maternal mortality rate is 214 per 100,000, and the teen pregnancy rate is skyrocketing at 66 per 1,000. But simultaneously, women hold 35% of the national parliament.
Yeah, the juxtaposition is jarring.
If over a third of the lawmakers are women, why is maternal health care still at disaster levels? Isn't the entire premise of political representation supposed to be that diverse voices in power will fix exactly these specific demographic vulnerabilities?
It is a brilliant question, and it strikes at the heart of political science. What you are observing is the gap between descriptive representation and substantive representation.
Oh, what's the difference?
Having a seat at the table, descriptive representation is the crucial first step. But simply changing the demographic makeup of a parliament does not instantly rewrite the macroeconomic constraints of a country.
So having the gavel doesn't mean you have the budget.
Precisely. Translating parliamentary seats into funded, executed, and sustained public health mandates is incredibly difficult. It requires building rural clinics from the ground up. It requires maintaining complex, refrigerated supply chains for maternal medicine across vast, often remote geographic areas.
That's not cheap.
It requires implementing comprehensive, culturally sensitive youth education programs. That takes massive systemic resources and institutional capacity. You can have the political will, you can pass the visionary legislation, but if the national budget is constrained by external shocks or debt servicing or legacy infrastructure deficits, the rural clinic simply does not get built.
It's the difference between passing a law to pave a road and actually having the asphalt, the tractors, and the labor to lay it down. The representation is there, but the execution is trapped by the reality of a developing economy.
Exactly. Now, rounding out the GII is the labor market dimension, specifically the labor force participation rate.
Right.
This measures the proportion of the working age population that is actively engaged in the labor market, either working or looking for work. For women in Namibia, it sits at 55.29%. For men, it is 60.72%.
What stands out to me here is not the absolute numbers, but how narrow the gap is. A difference of about 5.5 percentage points is actually quite remarkable when you look at global trends.
It really is.
Globally, the female labor force participation rate is a dismal 46.47%, while the male rate is highly elevated at 74.47%. So in Namibia, women are participating in the labor force at a rate much closer to their male counterparts than what we see on the global stage.
Yeah. It proves that women in Namibia are economically active and highly engaged. But we must remember the context we built earlier. They are participating at high rates, but they are doing so in sectors that pay less, all while shouldering that unpaid care burden we talked about.
So if we synthesize the reality of the GII, we get a profoundly complex picture. You have a society where women are highly visible in the halls of parliament, they are highly active and present in the workforce, they're staying in school longer,
Right.
but they're economically penalized for their gender, and they remain deeply physically vulnerable regarding their reproductive health. That is why they rank 121st in inequality.
The indices measure different altitudes of reality. The GDI looks at the ceiling, it measures the peaks of education and longevity. The GII looks at the floor, it asks, can you survive childbirth? Are you forced into parenthood as a teenager?
It's the floor versus the ceiling.
Exactly. It captures the bodily and structural vulnerabilities that the spreadsheet math of the GDI completely ignores.
But as fascinating as the gender paradox is, gender is not the only axis of inequality tearing at the fabric of this development. To fully grasp the hurdles facing Namibia, we have to step back. We have to look at the overarching internal inequality across all citizens, regardless of whether they are male or female.
This is crucial.
This brings us to the invisible taxes of inequality and poverty.
Okay.
Let's look at the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
If the HDI is the PR version of a country's progress, the IHDI is the audited financial statement.
I love that.
This metric answers a vital question. How much of a country's total potential human development is lost simply because those achievements are distributed unfairly? To calculate the IHDI, statisticians take the standard HDI score and literally discount it or penalize it based on how unequally the health, education, and income are hoarded by different segments of the population.
And the discount applied to Namibia is absolutely brutal. We noted earlier that their baseline PR-friendly HDI is 0.665. When you adjust that score for internal inequality, it plummets to 0.434.
That's a huge drop.
It represents a staggering 34.1% overall loss in human development. Over a third of the nation's progress is just erased. It evaporates because it isn't shared.
To give you a sense of scale, the global average loss due to inequality is roughly 21.96%. Namibia's loss is severely higher than the global norm.
And what's driving that?
When we drill down into the subcomponents of that 34% loss, the data isolates the main culprit. Inequality in life expectancy contributes a bit to the loss. Inequality in education contributes a bit. But inequality in income is the massive, undeniable driver. Income inequality accounts for 52.9% of that total developmental loss.
Over half of all the developmental progress being erased in Namibia is simply because the money is concentrated in too few hands. It acts like an invisible tax that erodes the foundation of national progress.
It really does.
We go back to the CEO and the factory worker analogy. You can have a relatively high average income on paper, but if the wealth is totally skewed toward a tiny elite, the average is a statistical lie.
Exactly.
Uh,
If you have a billionaire and a person living in extreme poverty, their average wealth is $500 million. But that average wealth does not buy the poor person a single loaf of bread. It doesn't fix their roof. It doesn't educate their child. This is why looking at income alone is a flawed methodology for understanding human suffering. We must look at the actual lived conditions, which brings us to the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
The MPI is fascinating because it abandons money entirely. It looks at multiple compounding deprivations at the household level across health, education, and standard of living. The report gives us MPI data from 2013, which shows an MPI value of 0.150 and a staggering poverty incidence of 40.9%.
That means over 40% of the population is experiencing multidimensional poverty.
Yep.
But what is truly crucial here is understanding what is driving that poverty. As you said, it isn't just a lack of cash in a bank account. The breakdown of the data shows the main drivers are severe structural and infrastructural deprivations.
Let's list these drivers out because they paint a vivid, honestly kind of bleak picture. Nutritional deprivation is the highest factor, contributing 28.3% to the overall poverty index. But look at the infrastructure deficits. Lack of cooking fuel contributes 11.5%. Lack of sanitation is 11.2%. And lack of electricity contributes 11.0%.
Let's think about what a lack of cooking fuel actually means for human development, because it is entirely intertwined with the gender inequality we discussed earlier. If 11.5% of your multidimensional poverty is driven by simply not having fuel, we aren't talking about a minor inconvenience like a power outage. We are talking about severe time poverty.
Right, because who is usually tasked with gathering wood or alternative fuels in a rural developing setting?
Women and girls. How many hours a day does it take to walk, to find fuel, gather it, and transport it back? Those are 3, 4, maybe 5 hours stripped away from studying, stripped away from participating in the formal labor market, stripped away from basic rest.
It's just exhausting to think about.
Furthermore, a lack of fuel dictates what you can eat. If you cannot boil water, you are exposed to waterborne pathogens. If you cannot afford the fuel to cook beans or tough grains for hours, your family suffers from protein deficiency, which ties directly back into that massive 28.3% nutritional deprivation figure. It creates a cascading failure across every single metric we have praised today.
We're talking about nearly half the country struggling to secure the physical combustion required to cook a meal, struggling to access a safe toilet, living in the dark without basic electricity.
It's the reality of the floor we mentioned.
When you synthesize this, when you realize that income inequality drives over half your national development loss and 40% of your people lack basic 20th century infrastructure, it completely reframes the narrative. You don't necessarily have a lack of resources in the aggregate. You have a profound distribution crisis.
A distribution crisis, yes.
The wealth exists within the borders, but the pipes designed to carry that wealth to the general population are fundamentally broken.
And fixing those pipes, building national electrical grids, constructing modern sanitation plants, and ensuring equitable supply chains for fuel and food requires a totally different kind of governance than simply trying to boost the GDP or attract foreign investment.
It's unglamorous work.
It requires a relentless, localized commitment to equitable infrastructure. You have to build the floor before you can raise the ceiling.
But there is one final dimension we have to consider in this deep dive. We've looked at health, education, income, gender, and multidimensional poverty. We've dissected how humans are treating other humans. But how does all this developmental scrambling impact the actual Earth they stand on?
The environment. Yes.
We have to look at the planet's ledger.
This brings us to a relatively new, incredibly vital metric introduced by the UN, the PHDI, or the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI. The methodology here is profound. It takes the standard HDI and adjusts it downward based on 2 specific environmental factors: the country's carbon dioxide emissions per capita and its material footprint per capita.
The philosophical idea being that human development shouldn't be considered a success if it requires destroying the host planet to achieve it.
Exactly. Historically, the countries sitting at the very top of the HDI rankings, the high-income Western nations, achieved those scores through centuries of massive, unregulated industrialization. They burned enormous amounts of fossil fuels to build their infrastructure and boost their life expectancy.
And left a massive mess.
The PHDI attempts to account for that historical and ongoing ecological debt. It penalizes development that comes at the expense of the planet.
So looking at Namibia's planetary pressures, the data shows their CO2 emissions per capita sit at a relatively low 1.60 tons. To compare that, the global average is nearly 3 times higher, sitting at 4.54 tons.
And because their ecological footprint is so remarkably small, their penalty on the PHDI is minimal. When adjusting their HDI for environmental impact, Namibia's score drops by only 8.1%. The global average drop is 10.05%, and for highly developed industrialized nations, the penalty drop is much, much steeper.
What's fascinating here is how the global rankings actually shift when you force countries to pay their environmental tab. On the standard unadjusted HDI, Namibia ranks 143rd, but on the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, they jump up the board to rank 111th. They actually hold a distinct comparative advantage when the environment is factored in.
But this highlights a deeply cruel irony of global development and climate change. Developing nations like Namibia often bear the lowest planetary pressure footprint. They're contributing a mere 1.6 tons of CO2 per capita. They are not the ones causing the bulk of global warming.
No, they're really not.
Yet due to their geographic locations and their reliance on rain-fed agriculture and natural resources, they're often the most exposed and vulnerable to the severe consequences of global climate change, the prolonged droughts, the catastrophic floods, and agricultural collapse.
It's a bitter pill. They aren't throwing the party, but they are being handed the bill for the damages. However, from a purely developmental standpoint, Namibia's data shows something optimistic. They are demonstrating that it is possible to increase human development to climb from a 0.597 to a 0.665 HDI without putting a massive, suffocating chokehold on the environment. That is a structural positive we cannot ignore.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's bring all these sprawling threads together. We have combed through decades of data. We've navigated the acronyms, the anomalies, and the devastating realities of structural inequality. Let's synthesize this deep dive by looking at Namibia's final 2023 global ranking matrix.
The overarching statistical profile is one of the most striking contrasts in global data. Number 1 in the Gender Development Index, number 121 in the Gender Inequality Index, number 143 in the Standard Human Development Index, and number 111 in the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
The ultimate takeaway from this report is the equality paradox. We have mathematically proven that a high GDI and a low HDI can comfortably coexist. But more importantly, we've exposed how a number 1 ranking in gender development can completely mask deep systemic flaws in actual gender equality.
The spreadsheet illusion.
You can achieve perfect parity on a spreadsheet while your citizens face severe, life-threatening vulnerabilities in reality. Averages hide the truth.
But the value of a comprehensive report like this is that it doesn't just leave us with a bleak diagnosis. It offers a specific, data-driven path forward. Based on everything we've unpacked, the report's conclusion lays out a clear, 4-step action blueprint to achieve true, inclusive growth.
Walk us through those steps.
First, translate the education dividend. The government and the private sector must aggressively intervene to dismantle occupational segregation. They must address the unpaid care burden. Women are acquiring the human capital. Society must ensure that high schooling translates into equal pay and formal labor access.
Right, the VIP ticket is valid. Now you have to force the security guards to let them into the front row.
Exactly. Second, fortify reproductive health. The GII will remain abysmal until there are massive, targeted public health campaigns and infrastructure investments to drastically lower that maternal mortality rate of 214 and the teen birth rate of 66. Political representation must translate into medical execution.
Third step, target poverty precisely. You cannot just throw broad economic stimulus at the economy and hope it trickles down. You have to fix the literal physical infrastructure driving the multidimensional poverty. You have to secure nutrition, build sanitation networks, and lay down electrical grids so young girls aren't spending 5 hours a day gathering cooking fuel.
Spot on. And finally, the fourth step. Govern inequality. With a 34.1% development loss due entirely to how wealth is distributed, there is an urgent existential need for income redistribution policies, progressive taxation, and equitable resource allocation. You have to claw back that lost potential by ensuring the wealth generated within the borders actually serves the people living within them.
It is a massive generational task, but the data has given them the map. They just have to walk the terrain.
That's a challenge ahead.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We started by looking at a statistical anomaly, a puzzle where the pieces didn't seem to fit. We thought we might find a simple accounting error, but instead we found a complex, breathing organism of a society, full of profound resilience and stark contradictions.
It's been a fascinating journey.
We've seen that true equality isn't just a mathematical ratio. It isn't just balancing an equation. It is about dismantling the invisible barriers that prevent raw human potential from turning into actual human dignity.
Beautifully said.
So, here is a lingering question for you to mull over as you go about your day. We've seen how the meticulous metrics used to measure global success can easily, almost accidentally, hide the harsh reality of lived experiences. What invisible inequalities are hiding in the metrics used to measure your own life, your workplace, or your society? If we only look at the averages, who are we leaving behind in the margins? Until next time, keep digging beneath the numbers.